A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. I seek refuge with God from Satan the accursed. Begin in the name of God, the beneficent, the merciful. All praise and glory is due to God, whose blessings cannot be counted by the counters, whose worth cannot be described by the speakers, and whose homage cannot be adequately paid by the worshippers. None can fully understand him, reason cannot visualize him, words cannot describe him, and human faculties of conception, perception, and intuition cannot fathom the extent of his majesty. There was no time when he did not exist, and there will be no duration without his existence. He created the universe with his omnipotence, and he knew the details of everything before he brought it into existence. I testify that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the servant and prophet of God. Almighty God has placed his trust in Muhammad and Ali Muhammad. May the peace of God be upon them. They are the group who protect his commands and his message, and they are the group who spread and explain his messages. So with those powerful words of the successor to our Prophet and our first Imam, my elders, brothers and sisters in Islam, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Tonight, obviously, is Shab-e Ashur, a night our Imam dedicated to worshipping and supplicating to God. By asking for a night's delay, our Imam was sending a message to Yazid's army. It was an opportunity to reflect for one final time before they would commit the atrocities that they did. And to future generation of Muslims about the importance of his love for God, and even faced with unbearable circumstances, thirst, lack of food, he still wanted time to pray to his Creator. So the topic I would like to talk about tonight, again in line with my theme of learning from the Prophet's life and his traditions, is the Prophet's spirituality and his worship. So what is spirituality? From an Islamic perspective, spirituality relates to our speech and action when done with God consciousness. Therefore, it can be any activity, as all actions should ideally accord with God's pleasure. Everything a Muslim does can be spiritual when done with awareness, mindfulness of God, and God consciousness. Because when we speak and act with such consciousness, then the results are obvious in terms of the inspiration that we get from God, the guidance we get from God, and the rationality and how we deal with our day-to-day activities. If they are done with that God consciousness, we tend to act and say the right things. We know that the Prophet, before the start of his mission, did not agree with the prevailing Arab practices. He had never taken part in any of their rituals, nor shared their beliefs, and had remained aloof from superstition and prejudice. He was a sensitive and contemplative man who used to take time out to think and ponder. He was searching for inner peace and meaning. When he was in the cave meditating, he used to have some very powerful spiritual experiences, a sort of inward illumination, deeper than inspiration and intuition. As these experiences became more dear to him, he would spend a lot more time, more frequently going up to that mountain. And during one of these meditative retreats, as we can say, the Prophet heard the words, Assalamu alayka ya Rasulullah, peace be upon you, O Messenger of God. Salawat. Allahumma salli ala. So the process of revelation was about to commence. And what I want to do now is to actually examine three particular spiritual experiences of the Prophet's life that carry some educational value for us. The first experience was during the Battle of Badr, when the Holy Prophet picked some pebbles and dust from the ground and threw them towards the Meccan enemy. And the Quran relates this in Surah Anfal, verse 17, when God says, "When you threw, it was not you that threw, but God that threw." So this was a demonstration of the Holy Prophet surrendering his will to God, so that his action was attributed by God to himself. The Prophet's will was so in accord with the divine will that he simply became an instrument for God's will. A similar thing is recorded in the sacred conversation between God and the Prophet in Hadith Qudsi, which is practiced by Muslims seeking spiritual enlightenment. And according to this saying, when the faithful servants approach God by means of sincere and focused prayers and acts of worship beyond what's required, beyond the obligatory prayers, by doing nawafil prayers and tahajjud prayers, God loves them. And when God loves them, He becomes the eyes through which they see, the ears through which they hear, the hands by which they act, and the feet with which they walk. Now this obviously is a station of the prophets and the imams, but for ordinary Muslims too, by following the Prophet's example in making your will subservient to God's will, you and I can attract God's love. As I said in Surah Imran a few majalises ago, verse number 31, say, if you love God, then follow me, follow the Prophet. God will love you, and He is often loving and forgiving. The second incident that again shows the Prophet's high spirituality is connected to the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, which we mentioned before. So to explain this particular part, we need to go into a bit more detail. Now, in the month of Ramadan, typically the Prophet used to increase his worship, especially at night, and he used to pay more attention to the poor and the needy. The command for fasting came in the second year of Hijrah, in that year's Ramadan, as it happens. And the Prophet had a dream in which he saw himself in the Kaaba sanctuary with his head shaved and with the keys to the Kaaba in his hands. And he interpreted this dream as a sign that he needed to go for the lesser pilgrimage, the Umrah. So he invited his companions to join him to go and perform the Umrah. Between 1,200 and 1,400 of his faithful companions went, and when they arrived at the edge of Makkah, in the plain of Hudaybiyah, the Prophet's camel, Khaswa, stopped. And the Prophet saw this as a sign. He stopped there and tried to negotiate his entry, because clearly the Makkans weren't prepared to let the Muslims in. Now, in the negotiations that followed, the Prophet made a number of compromises and concessions against the advice of his companions, and it'll become clear why he did that. So, for example, the treaty that they started to write following the negotiations, the Prophet said needs to start with Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, and these people said, well, if we believed in your God, we wouldn't be having this argument. We would have no issue you coming in. So he had to drop that idea, and he had to put in, instead of Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Bismika Allahumma, in your name, O God. Okay, then at the end of the treaty, the Prophet, or Imam Ali, who was actually writing the treaty, wanted to sign off with the messenger of God. And again, they argued that because they didn't accept him as the messenger of God, they couldn't have that on the treaty either. So he just had to sign off with his name, Muhammad ibn Abdullah. So such compromises at the time created a lot of tension, because the companions were not prepared to accept that. They were actually prepared to fight to force themselves into Makkah. But the Prophet's deep spirituality stopped him from reacting emotionally, from losing his temper, and the time later was to prove that peace and stability which he engendered through this treaty allowed the Muslim community to grow, and he could come back next year with a much stronger contingent and win over Makkah. The third episode, again an indicator of his spirituality, happened towards the end of his mission and actually recaps the teachings of earlier revelations. Now, according to this narrative, which is a little bit long, so please pay attention. The Prophet was sitting with a small group of companions, and a mysterious visitor came and sat down next to him. He placed his hands on the Prophet's thighs and said, "O Muhammad, tell me, what is the meaning of submission?" The Prophet answered, "Submission, Islam, is to testify that there is no God but God and that Muhammad is the messenger of God, to perform the prayer, give alms, fast during Ramadan, and if one can, to go to pilgrimage to Makkah." The questioner said, "You have spoken truthfully." The companions were astonished that this stranger would approach the Prophet in such an intimate way and then proceed to confirm the Prophet's answer. He then said, "Tell me, what is the meaning of faith, Iman?" And the Prophet answered, "To have faith in God and His angels and His scriptures and His messengers and the last day, and to have faith that no evil or good comes but by His providence." Yet again, the speaker affirmed, "You have spoken truly," and asked his next question, "What is spiritual excellence or ihsan?" And the Prophet responded, "It is to worship God as if you see Him, and if you cannot see Him, to recall that He sees you." So after hearing this answer, the questioner departed. The Prophet turned to his companions and said that was Jibreel, who had come to teach you or recap your religion to you. So there are a number of lessons we can learn from this narrative, and I'll mention 3 of them. Number 1, the teaching model was from God to Jibreel, from Jibreel to the Prophet, from Prophet to the companions, and ultimately to the listeners of this episode in our time. And that is a transmission of the grace and teachings of the Prophet. The second point is it shows that faith, the kalama, the belief in the angels, the messengers, and the last day, has to be associated with action, has to be demonstrated through action, i.e. in prayers, in charity, in fasting and Hajj. And spirituality is actually connected with the awareness of God. So they all go hand in hand. It is not enough to have faith in God and the Prophet, but one must also perform the prayers, the fasting, and feeding the poor. The goal of religious life is to see God as the Prophet saw God. If we cannot, and most of us cannot, then we are reminded to be aware and mindful of how we act in our daily lives, because God is watching us. So overall, what this episode tells us about our religion is Islam, or submission to God, is only the first level. Above Islam comes faith or Iman, and above Iman is Ihsan, which is the ultimate rank of the friends of God. Now, Islam, in a general sense, because we say that the religion as far as God was concerned has always been Islam, even prior to the Prophet bringing the Islam with a capital I. So God has always wanted humans to submit. So to Him, the religion has always been Islam. And for Muslims then, or some Muslims to then claim that the Islam that we had is exclusive, is special, and is different from what was given as a guidance to others, to me, doesn't actually stack up. So these friends of God, these saints, they embody the quality of ihsan and are single-minded in their following of the Prophet, hoping all the time to rise up to encounter God as the Prophet rose to meet God through his heavenly ascension. They also obviously purify their hearts, some say polish their rusty hearts to reflect God's attributes. Because the heart, or the qalb, is where the first priority should be given to God. The awliya, the friends of God, used to keep it empty. Apart from remembering God in their hearts, they used to empty it of all other desires, and treating the heart as a vessel totally dedicated to the remembrance of God. So how can we bring about more spirituality in our lives and our worship? As I said before, in general terms, all thinking and action that conforms with God's commands and his instructions can be classified as spiritual. And also, what is spirit? What is the soul, the ruh? The Quran refers to the spirit as a command of God. Also, when referring to the creation of Hazrat Adam, God says, after making his body from clay, he breathed his spirit into him, and he stood up, a man. So based on these Quranic statements, we understand that we are all given a body to be used by our spirit, our soul, to carry out God's instructions and his commands, and indeed to live a life in accordance with his will. Now, specifically, I've identified 4 broad headings under which we can act to increase our own spirituality. Number 1, prayer. Number 2, supplication, zikr or remembrance. Number 3, reading the Quran. And number 4, doing good deeds. So let's consider each one of these and identify what we can do to improve our performance and get closer to how the Prophet performed these actions. Prayer or salat is the key to getting closer to God. Also keeps one away from sins and sets one's heart at rest. It is said, when you want to speak to Allah, offer salat. When you want to listen to Allah, read the Quran. So the remembrance of Allah in salat is like Allah likes humanity to remember him, as he said in the Quran, you remember me, I'll remember you. So the 5 times prayers are considered by some people as the minimum requirement for remembrance. So at least you stop for 5 times in the day to pray to your Lord. And that's the minimum. So in our busy lives, we obviously tend to rush our prayers, almost treating them as a chore, getting it out of the way quickly. But in doing so, we are missing out on an opportunity to really connect with our Creator and thinking about other things, about his signs, about his grace, about his purpose. So we need to all build a positive attitude towards prayer, which is essential for spiritual growth. We should constantly strive to improve our concentration in prayer, and this requires focus and awareness right from the preparation stage, from the time we start to do wuzu, to the azan, to the iqama, to the niyat, and of course reciting the surahs and the du'as in qunut. For most of us who don't speak Arabic, it obviously helps to know the meaning of what we are reading to remain focused. And the other essential thing to imagine or bear in mind when we are praying is that we are in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And although we cannot see him, he sees us. There is incidentally a good book which I recently came across on 101 ways to Concentrate in Prayer by Dr. Ali Hilli. It was, I think, published earlier this year, and it's not a very big book, but it's got some interesting techniques and ways of keeping your attention focused. I would recommend people to, I think it's available on Amazon. So beyond the 5 obligatory prayers, which as I said were the minimum, to increase our spirituality, it is recommended that we find time for nawafil and sunnat prayers, especially the night prayers, tahajjud prayers. And to encourage believers to pray the nawafil or sunnat prayers, it's actually possible to do them while you're sitting or standing, or even while you're driving the car. You only need to read the first surah. You don't have to read a second surah and go into ruku. It was obligatory on the Prophet, obviously, to spend part of his night in worship. And night is the time when it is quiet, when it is tranquil, without any distractions, when one can totally absorb him or herself in the remembrance of Allah. The second thing we can do to improve our spirituality is supplication and remembrance. So when it comes to du'as, we are blessed with an amazing legacy from the Prophet and the Imams. These highly spiritual characters have left a deep and creative examples of approaching God with some of the supplications are quite familiar. There's the Du'a Yastashir, dua taught by the Prophet to Imam Ali. The famous du'as of Du'a Kumail, Sabah and Mashlul by Imam Ali, of course. And the big treasure of dua, the Sahif Sajjadiyah from our fourth Imam, the Psalms of Islam. Now this complete book of du'as actually covers du'as on a daily basis, du'as for various human conditions, and has been the mainstay of spiritual improvement, spiritual increase in your iman. So, although it is beneficial to read these du'as, but I think we need to go one step ahead and actually learn on how the Imams and the Prophet used to converse with God, and try to develop our own dialogue, our own conversation, and learn from some of the creative thinking that the experts did. So again, it's tempting to rush out after Salat, though if we are honest, how long does it take to read the du'as? Maybe 5 minutes, 10 minutes? And nowadays with mobile phones and so on, you get du'as as phone apps, which most people can read. So we need to get into the habit of enriching our Salat experience by including some du'as in there. In addition to the du'as, there is, for those of us who have time, zikr is a very important aspect of increasing your spirituality, keeps you connected to God. As I said before, hearts are rested with the remembrance of God. And one very easy and yet very significant way of remembering is the tasbih of Bibi Fatima. Now, according to our Imams, it is a simple, short, yet powerful act of worship. Its effect, its rewards, and its merits are many. And this was given to her by her father in response to her request for some material help. And in this context, our fifth Imam, Imam Muhammad Baqir alayhi salam, he said that Allah is not worshipped by anything more meritorious than the tasbih of Fatima Zahra alayhi salam. Had there been any worship superior to it, most surely the Holy Prophet would have granted it to Bibi Fatima. So the next activity to increase spirituality is reading the Quran. As I said, do Salat when you want to speak to Allah, and read the Quran when you want to hear Him. So again, many spiritual benefits of reading the Quran, and I want to mention a couple of hadiths of the Prophet. First one says, when one of you would like to converse with his Lord, he should read the Quran. And from a spiritual upliftment perspective, when matters become obscure for you, like the darkness of night, then turn to the Quran. For it is the mediating intercessor and the trustworthy divisor. Whoever puts it in front of them, it will lead them to heaven. And whoever puts it behind them, it will drag them to hell. So again, most of us come up with excuses when it comes to reading the Quran: lack of time, can't read Arabic, finding it difficult to understand, not being in the right state of mind, and so on. But really, where there's a will, there's a way. Can we not find 10 minutes to read the Quran on a daily basis? 10 verses daily? If we make Quran reading a habit, the special mental state that we are seeking will eventually come. And if we want to obviously understand the Quran, then we can go to some Quran classes. And nowadays, apparently, there are online classes available with teachers from Pakistan and other places. The amount of Quran you read is not that important as the quality of your understanding. So if you spend 15 minutes just reading a few verses, but you understand them thoroughly and you ponder over them, it's better than reciting a lot quickly. So to truly benefit from Quran recitation, the heart must be attentive and alert. And when reciting or listening, you need to pay attention, as if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself was speaking to you. So the final activity for improving our spirituality, good deeds, which is another avenue. So virtuous deeds, they can range from giving charity, volunteering to help people with your knowledge and your skills, going for ziyarat, and so on. So every good deed adds positive points to the spiritual ledger. And as the Quran says in Surah Anam, whoever comes with a good deed shall receive 10 times its likes, but whoever comes with an evil deed, he shall be recompensed not, but with the like of it, and they shall not be dealt with unjustly. But please remember, when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what you've given with your right hand, so that your giving may be in secret. There's one Prophet's advice which I picked up in my research, was quite demanding. He said to divide one's waking hours, apart from your sleep, your waking hours into 1/3 business, 1/3 with your family, and 1/3 worship. So this shows the importance the Prophet placed on worship. Obviously 1/3 may not be possible for everyone, but what it should include certainly is nawafil prayers, making dua and zikr, reading the Quran, and good deeds. So I want to conclude this section of the talk by quoting a beautiful Quranic verse from Surah Baqarah, where God says, "When my servants ask you about me, I'm always near. I answer their prayers when they pray to me. The people shall respond to me and believe in me in order to be guided." So brothers and sisters, tonight is the 9th of Muharram, is the night the Imam dedicated to worshipping and supplicating to God. It is a night when mothers looked at their sons and sisters looked at their brothers, knowing that it may be the last time they see them in this life on earth. Tonight it is traditional to recite the martyrdom of the 6-month-old Ali Asghar. The friends and family of Imam Hussein had all sacrificed their lives. The Imam was now all alone. He looked to his right and to his left. The enemy was emboldened that the standard bearer of Imam, Hazrat Abbas, was no more. The Imam himself was already wounded. His head, his arms, his chest had already received many injuries through the arrows and the lances of the enemy. His heart was heavy with the loss of all his companions and family members. He raises his voice and says, Hal min nasirin yansuruna, is there any helper to come to my help? There was none to respond. He then addressed his departed companions and family members, O my braves of the battlefield, Hussein is calling you, and you do not reply. Till recently, you were with me. A body fluttered by the banks of the Euphrates. O Abbas, be restful. Hussein would soon join you. The Imam approached the tents and heard Rabab crying. The Imam entered her tent to inquire, and she said, when you raised your voice, seeking help, our son Ali Asghar fell out of his cot. He is dying of thirst. Can you please do something to save him? After a moment's thinking, the Imam said to her, Rabab, give Ali Asghar to me. As a last attempt, I shall take him in my arms and appeal to the army of Yazid to give him some water to save his innocent life. Hussein took the child in his arms, covered him with his robe to protect him from the heat of the sun outside, and went out of the tent. The soldiers saw Hussein bringing something held under his robe. Many thought that Hussein was bringing the Holy Quran as a means of arbitration. He walked towards them and stopped when he felt that they could see and hear him clearly. He then removed his robe, which was covering Ali Asghar. He held the child high in his hands, and in a loud voice, he said, O soldiers of Kufa and Damascus, if in your warped judgment we have committed a crime but by not bowing to the will of the tyrant Yazid, this young son of mine has not committed any sin. For the last 3 days he has had no nourishment, not even water. He is now dying of thirst. Islam is the religion you profess to follow, and in the name of Islam I appeal to you to give a little water to my innocent son to save his life. Listening to his appeal, some soldiers began to cry and turned away. Perhaps they had young children themselves and could relate to a father's helplessness, even in the middle of a battle. Umar Saad saw that unless he quickly dealt with the situation, Hussein could melt the hearts of some of his soldiers. The momentum and the spirit of fighting would be lost. He instructed his best archer, Hurmula, to shoot the child and quell any sympathy among his soldiers towards him. To encourage him, this heartless man said to Hurmula, here is a chance for you to earn the best favor from Yazid. His greed killed any humanity in Hurmula, and on the 3rd attempt, the arrow found its target. It was too big for the throat of a 6-month baby. It was sent with such force that it went through Ali Asghar's neck and lodged in the arm of Imam Hussein. Blood gushed out from the wound. Hussein removed the arrow and held his infant son close to his chest. He started to walk back towards the camp, thinking, how can I show Ali Asghar in this state to Rabab? Should I bury him first? In this agonizing dilemma, the Imam went forwards and retraced his steps, saying, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un, rizan bi khazaihi wa tasliman li amri. We are from God, and to Him is our return. Imam decided to take the body of Ali Asghar back to the camp for Rabab to have one last look at her baby. As soon as he entered the tent, he saw the anxious mother waiting. Seeing the state of the Imam with blood smeared on his face, Rabab feared the worst. Imam said to her, Rabab, you must be patient, and handed over Ali Asghar's body to her. Rabab took one look at her dead child, clasped him to her chest, and collapsed. After burying Ali Asghar, the Imam started to prepare for his final departure to the battlefield. The Imam approached the tent of her sister, Zainab, and Zainab already found that her brother had many wounds to his body. She did not say a word and covered his wounds with her mantle. The Imam asked her to get some old clothes. He changed into these worn-out clothes. He was thinking ahead to his martyrdom and hoping that his body may be left covered and not looted if he had old clothes on him. Lastly, he arrived by the side of his sick and unconscious son. He placed his right hand on the right arm of Abd al-Bimar and recited Surah Hamd. His tears dropped on the cheeks of Sayyid Sajjad, who opened his eyes and exclaimed, "Father, you are severely wounded. Has Uncle Abbas been killed?" The Imam replied, "Yes, my son, he was killed." "Is Ali Akbar also no more?" Again the Imam replied, "He too died fighting." "What about your companions, Habib, Zuhair, Muslim?" Imam said, "Son, apart from you and me, there are no male members left." The Abd al-Bimar exclaimed, "Ya Ali," and stood up from his sick bed. Imam Hussain urged him to lie down. He advised him that the succession of Imams has to continue for the protection of the mission of the Prophets and the declaration of the Kalama. Imam said, "O son, you are the protector of the religion going forwards. When you return to Medina, convey my salam to my friends. Tell them not to forget me while drinking cold water. And also remember me when you hear about the troubles faced by someone away from his house, from his homeland. Tell them that Hussein missed them a lot, and had they been here, they might have witnessed how I was pleading for water for my child Azhar." Hussein was bidding farewell to all the ladies and children, and his mother's maid, Fizza. "My last salam to all of you." The children felt nervous. The ladies felt vulnerable. The fifth of the Holy Five, the heir to the Panjatan, was departing. Zainab appealed to Imam Hussein to sit down for a while. Then she went around him 3 times, telling him that it was the last wish of his mother. Hussein called her by his side and kissed her arms, telling her that he too was fulfilling mother's wish. Hussein consoled them. "Zainab, maintain your resilience. Farwa, observe patience. Zainab, do not dishevel your hair." Hussein came out of the camp and exclaimed, "Is there anyone to get my horse for me?" None was there to answer the Imam. The horse stepped forward, bowing down its neck. Zainab held the stirrups to help the Imam to get up on the mount. Hussein whispered to Zuljana to proceed for the last ride, but the horse refused to move. Hussein looked downwards and found that Sakina was hugging the legs of the horse. She was pleading, "Oh father, don't leave me alone. Don't leave me alone." Lanatullahi, khawmuz zalimeen, fasayalamu zumbi. Matam Hussein.